two from the Israeli outlets, and then if there is any extra time, perhaps we'll take one more from each side. And before I turn this over to the ambassador, I'd also like to introduce Garrett Markey, the U.S. spokesman for the National Security Council. If those of you who don't get your questions answered or you want to follow up, be sure to get Garrett's contact information. Certainly give him yours. With that, I'd like to welcome Ambassador John Bolton.
Well, thanks very much, Sarah. I want to just start off by saying how much we appreciate all the work that Ambassador Friedman and his staff at the embassy have done to help facilitate the trip. I know from past experience how much work's involved for the delegation traveling with me, but for the embassy people on the ground too. So it's been a very full visit, starting with discussions with the Prime Minister and many others in his government, and discuss the whole range of issues that confront Israel and the United States and our alliance. I think there are two notable things I'd say that you've seen in the press already. The decision President made to extradite to Germany a Nazi concentration camp guard, long sought and ordered actually years ago, but President Trump actually carried it out. And then second, the unsealing of an indictment the day before yesterday involving the arrest of two Iranian agents in the United States conducting surveillance of Israeli and Jewish sites in the United States. When you combine it with the Israeli intelligence services conspiracy to bomb an Iranian opposition rally in Paris a few months ago. I love hearing those words, but maybe I'll just say it once and get it out of the way here. I think this demonstrates as vividly as you can the threat that Iran poses in Europe and in the United States, and it underlines again the importance of making sure that Iran never gets nuclear weapons, which was probably the predominant subject in the whole range of meetings that we had here in Israel. So with that, I think it may be easier to answer your questions. So Val, if you want to follow your procedure.
First question is to the Wall Street Journal. And be sure to say both your name and your outlet.
Thanks, Ambassador. I'm Felicia Schwartz with the Wall Street Journal. You said in an interview published today that Putin told Trump that Moscow can't get Iran fully out of Syria. So how far back do Israel and the U.S. think that Russia can pressure Iran away from the border? And if it's not more than 85 or 100 kilometers that we're seeing now, would you support or encourage Israel to take more strikes in Syria? And what would the U.S. on Iranian targets? And what would the U.S. be prepared to do? And what will you then tell your Russian counterpart?
Okay, I can remember all those questions, I'm sure. Let me just back up a minute and to explain what I think President Putin said. And he had said it to me 3 weeks before, so I feel pretty confident he had a particular outcome in mind. What he was saying was that Iranian interests in Syria were not coterminous with Russian interests in Syria, and that he would be content to see the Iranian forces all sent back to Iran. It wasn't a question of where they might be inside Syria. We were talking about the complete return of both regular and irregular Iranian forces. But he said, I can't do it myself. So the point was, the point was that perhaps joint U.S.-Russian efforts might be sufficient. Now, I don't know that that's right either, but it's certainly one of the subjects that I'll be discussing with my Russian counterpart in Geneva tomorrow to try and follow up on the discussions on Syria that President Putin and President Trump had in Helsinki on that subject.
Okay, the second question goes to Mikhail Stern of The U.S. said in the past several times that the recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel was a natural thing. This is the thing that should have been done. And suddenly Trump speaks tonight and says that Israel will pay a big price for this. What caused the change of the U.S. policy regarding this calling of the recognition as a price? And second, what might this price be?
Well, I don't think there's any change in policy. I think the president looked at the recognition of Jerusalem as being Israel's capital and the ineluctable consequence of that, which is that the U.S. Embassy ought to be in the capital city of the country to which it's accredited as the right and natural thing to do. And it was not an issue of quid pro quo. He's made the point, I think, several times that this issue has been a hang-up in negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians. And as he said last night as well, he's taken that issue off the table. As a deal maker, as a bargainer, he would expect, you would expect, I would expect that the Palestinians would say, okay, great, so we didn't get that one, now we want something else. And we'll see how it goes. But the fundamental point is that ultimately this is something that the parties are going to have to agree on. One of the most cogent things I've ever heard about the Middle East was something that Secretary of State Jim Baker said during the George H.W. Bush administration: we can't want peace more than the parties themselves. And when the parties talk about it and agree, they'll decide between themselves what, if anything, the price of that was. I think it's a much bigger negotiation. I think the real point is that the president did the right thing in moving the embassy to Israel's capital, and that in and of itself brings reality to a negotiation that honestly for decades has been conducted in an era of unreality. So I think in that sense it was a very positive step forward, not just for Israel but for the Palestinians as well.
The next question, Washington Post. Hi, Loveday Morris from the Washington Post. I wanted to ask you about the street demonstrations in Iran. In your opinion, are they posing a tangible threat to the regime? Have you discussed plans with your Israeli counterparts here on how to capitalize on that? And ultimately, would you like to see regime change in that context, or do you think that that would be a destabilizing development in the Middle East?
Well, just to be clear, regime change in Iran is not American policy. But what we want is massive change in the regime's behavior. And among other things, and the administration policy, which is across the board really, was articulated by Secretary of State Pompeo in a speech that he gave at the Heritage Foundation a few weeks after the president withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal. The fact is that Iran's economy has been mismanaged for a long time, and that the effects of this mismanagement throughout the country have been known. The Iran nuclear deal mitigated the effects of its mismanagement of the economy and gave the regime new life, gave this regime that's been the central banker of international terrorism since 1979, new assets that it could use for its nuclear weapons program, for its ballistic missile program, for its terrorist support activities, for its conventional military activities. And we saw the consequences of the provision of these new resources in not reduced Iranian belligerency in the region after 2015, but increased Iranian belligerency in the region. So it was, I think, a demonstration that not only was the Iran nuclear deal bad on its own terms, but the fundamental political premise that underlay the Obama administration's policy was wrong. That being that if you could resolve the nuclear issue with Iran, its behavior would change and it would behave like a normal nation. That was flatly wrong. It was 180 degrees the opposite of what happened. But as a result of the lifting of the sanctions, the regime in Tehran acted as though it had a free hand. Had a free hand in the region, had a free hand with the new resources, had a free hand economically. And by bringing the hammer down again of reimposing American sanctions, we've seen a profound negative effect on Iran. I think actually more serious than we would have predicted. And what's significant about the demonstrations and outpourings that you've seen across Iran is that, to the best of our knowledge, they're not organized. This is not some kind of conspiracy in Iran. It's just regular people saying they're fed up with the government. In small towns and cities, it's not the educated elite in Tehran, it's farmers and workers and small shop owners who are shouting death to the regime, not death to America, death to the regime. I think it's a continuation in many respects of the demonstrations we saw in December, but I think they're continuing and growing. And that's an issue the regime's going to have to factor in. They know what we expect of them. We've declared it very openly. And when they're ready to conform to that, then there's a possibility of a settlement. And if they don't, then we're just simply going to do what the president has said repeatedly and exert maximum pressure on Iran to make it clear that they will never get deliverable nuclear weapons.
Hello, Ariel Kahana from Israel Hayom. Two questions, please. First of all, regard Syria. If Russia can't pull the Iranians out from Syria, and the US can do it, the meaning is that Israel will have to handle it alone. In other words, a war, might be a war between Israel and Syria. That, the way I see it, the outcome. And secondly, about the peace deal, there were some reports that it's going to be presented during the UN Assembly in September. Is that correct? Maybe you're going to wait until after the elections in the US and maybe in Israel in the winter. Thank you.
Well, let me say on the peace plan, work continues. There are a lot of consultations that are underway, and there's no decision on the timing of when the full details of the plan will be announced. I think there's been a lot of progress in relations in the region as a result of the process of going through the possible outlines of what the plan would look like. I think there have been dramatic geostrategic changes in the Middle East with the recognition that the Iran nuclear deal has failed and failed badly. And so that gives the possibility of realignment with Israel and many of its Arab neighbors that nobody would have predicted years before. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to try and take full advantage of that. But in terms of the specifics of when the plan might be rolled out, as I say, no decision made. Now, on Syria, look, it's extraordinarily complicated there. There aren't two sides, there are about 7 or 8 sides. And that's one reason why finding an overall resolution is so difficult. But what is absolutely central to American policy is that we're determined to finish the job of eliminating the ISIS territorial caliphate, but also to deal with the consequences of continuing ISIS activity in Syria and Iraq, but also to deal with the presence of the Iranians, that this is something that perhaps the Obama administration didn't foresee, whether they should have or not, didn't foresee at the beginning of the anti-ISIS campaign, that Iran obviously had a strategic plan to create an arc of control from Iran through the Shia areas of Iraq into Syria, linking up with Hezbollah in Lebanon. That's not something that we want to see. So we're still working through that. Every time Iran has brought missiles or other threatening weapons into Syria in recent months, Israel has struck those targets. I think that's a legitimate act of self-defense on the part of Israel. We have also acted militarily, twice striking targets in Syria after the Assad regime used chemical weapons. Second time being during my first week as National Security Advisor. We now see plans for the Syrian regime to resume offensive military activities in Idlib province. We are obviously concerned about the possibility that Assad may use chemical weapons again. We had hoped that our strikes had created structures of deterrence to convince the Assad regime not to do that. We hope that's right, but just so there's no confusion here, if the Syrian regime uses chemical weapons, we will respond very strongly. And they really ought to think about this a long time before they come to any decision, because there's no ambiguity in the U.S. position on this point. So this is a very delicate, very difficult situation in Syria, but one that we're not going to allow the Iranians to take advantage of. So I think we can...
For two more questions, one on the U.S. side and one from the international. Val?
Fox News.
Thank you, Ambassador Bolton. Trey Inks with Fox News. Following your meetings with the Israelis, what tangible steps developed in terms of ways to encourage allies around the globe to put more pressure on Iran? And what role will President Trump play in encouraging this pressure?
Well, we've talked a lot about the whole range of issues connected with Iran. I briefed the Prime Minister and other Israeli officials on diplomatic discussions that we've had underway with the Europeans ever since May, at the end of my first month in this office, when the President withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal, to explain why we did it and to encourage them to come along with us, to put increased pressure on Iran because of its malign activities, not just the nuclear program, but its continued pursuit of ballistic missiles, which are designed to be delivery systems for nuclear weapons, its continued support of international terrorism, and its conventional military activity in the region. This is also something President Macron of France has talked about, and he and the President have had a number of discussions on that point. I've had extensive discussions with the British and the Germans, as well as the French. We talked about all of that. We talked about the efforts that the United States is making to ensure that other countries around the world that have been purchasers of Iranian petroleum have alternative sources of petroleum so that we can drive Iranian oil exports down to zero. We talked about the President's determination in reimposing the sanctions, that we're not just going to stop at where the sanctions were in 2015. Our goal, our objective really is essentially, we'd like to say no waivers to the sanctions. So far, after a little bit over 90 days with the first wind-down period now ended, we've only granted 2 waivers, both very limited. And that's intended to be a very different kind of enforcement of the sanctions than occurred during the Obama administration. But as I say, we're not going to stop there either. We talked about additional economic sanctions that could be imposed to achieve the President's goal of maximum pressure. I just think this is very important because the consequences of the reduction in resources available to the regime, we think, is already manifest in some extent in constraints on the Quds force in Syria and Iraq, and perhaps also in its assistance to the Houthis in Yemen. And that's very important. We're going to do other things to put pressure on Iran as well beyond economic sanctions. We talked about that. And we talked about a number of things that I can't talk about publicly.
Thank you.
Thank you, Barak Ravid, Channel 10 News. Mr. Ambassador, last week Israel has reached an agreement with the U.S. designated terrorist organization Hamas about a ceasefire in Gaza. I was wondering if the U.S. administration supports such a deal between Israel and the terrorist organization Hamas. And a second question, the President said tonight that Israel will have to pay a high price for moving the embassy to Jerusalem. Does that mean that the U.S. administration's peace plan going to include U.S. support for an independent Palestinian state?
Well, I think I answered the second question before, and ultimately any agreement between Israel and the Palestinians, whatever shape it takes, is going to require agreement of the parties. It's not something the U.S. is prepared to force on anybody. In terms of Hamas, dealing with the terrorist group is you get what you might expect from it. I can't even begin to count the number of ceasefires we've heard from Hamas, Hezbollah, other terrorist groups over the years. I would be stunned if anybody in the government of Israel is viewing this with anything other than very, very clear-eyed understanding of what it's about. If Hamas cared more about the people of the Gaza Strip than their political priorities, we wouldn't have a lot of these troubles, and I think it's a sad outcome for the Palestinian people that all they've got now is a choice between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. So there are a lot of prospects really to find ways here to resolve some of these problems and give the people of Palestine, who have been used as agents by radical leaders over the years for their own political purposes, to give them and their families a chance for a decent life going forward. And I think that's the ultimate objective of the peace plan that the President has been overseeing. And when we're ready to roll it out, and we do, I hope that'll be visible to all the affected stakeholders in the region. Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone. If you have any additional questions.